your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News Weekend Edition.
Hello, I'm Naveen Day. Thanks for joining us for our Week in Review. The Trudeau Liberals, along with the Bloc, shot down a Conservative motion to put a temporary carbon tax pause on all home heating. This carbon tax continues to hurt many in our community as the rising cost of living continues to climb. Bill Ginther, who runs the Lethbridge Soup Kitchen, says it's not only the carbon tax which is hurting them, but also electricity rates, which have gone up quite a bit.
One of the things we found, first of all, is that the price of utilities has gone completely through the roof. Just an example, for 3 years running, our utility bill, which is mostly electrical, was about $1,700 a month. It went up to $2,900, then went to $39, then to $49, and went just over $5,000 for exactly the same service we had for years. So in our case, I mean, that's a major hit when you have an organization that runs, on simply donated monies, and there's only a certain amount that you have available. So what we did is we actually switched companies, and we ended up going back to about $100 more than we had been spending on that before. So that's one side of it. The other side is that we obviously spend a lot more for everything, including fuel for our vehicles. We do pickups every day. Obviously, in order for us to keep operating, we will go to all the grocery stores, pick up food, etc. And of course, the fuel costs are really, really high. And we know that it impacts everything, including the groceries we have to buy. So yeah, it's a major thing, and it's unfortunate that we don't look at that, or that there isn't a break for nonprofits, but that's our reality.
Ken Kissick, who is the founder of the Streets Alive Christian Mission in Lethbridge, agrees that the rising cost of living has been hurting his group as well. Streets Alive provides for many of our most vulnerable in the city, including those who are homeless. He says the federal carbon tax has really taken its toll.
Well, obviously, the carbon tax is affecting everybody. So for charities like ours, donors have less money to donate, and then our costs are up. Utility costs are probably doubled in the last year for us. We're heading into a winter season. You've got inflation, so it's making things very, very tight for us.
Some recent job numbers show that from January to October, employment in Alberta has increased by almost 84,000 jobs, just under 83% of those jobs being full-time. According to Stats Canada and ATB Economics, most are coming from the private sector. To chat about the job numbers in more detail is the CEO of Economic Development Lethbridge, Trevor Lewington, who joined Hal Roberts.
Trevor, which sectors specifically have been doing a lot of the hiring? Construction, technology, retail?
Provincially, the construction sector has rebounded quite nicely, which is good to see because that has such a broad impact across other areas of the economy. Manufacturing here in Lethbridge has done quite well so far this year. And we're always thrilled when manufacturing does well because of the sort of overstated impact it has on the rest of the value chain. It creates jobs elsewhere in the system. So, good news that there's the majority of jobs created in the province were full-time, and also the vast majority coming from the private sector.
Now, according to this recent study, it says mostly those aged 25 to 54 who are finding employment, or about 55%. But over 26% of those over the age of 55 are also finding work.
We would typically expect to see the vast majority of employment in that 25 to 54 age demographic. That is your key working years. But to your point, exciting when you see seniors and others able to access the employment, gain access to jobs and drive the economy forward as well. So nice to see that the job gains are broad-based across sort of every age demographic out there.
Lethbridge Police Service had 4 recent town hall meetings to hear the concerns from local residents. Lethbridge Police Chief Shaheen Medizadeh says the drug problems and related crime in the city are still the biggest concerns for most.
There is still a lot of anxiety over opioid issues, drug problems, and homelessness in the community, and that's we certainly hear that loud, and we try to do what we can in our capacity to deal with those. There were also other comments about traffic enforcement and really crime in general. So this was a great opportunity for us, obviously, to hear from our citizens, to see what's on their mind, what's keeping them up at night, and also provide them with all the stuff, all the initiatives that we have on the go so they can be assured that we are doing whatever we can with the capacity that we have to serve the community and make it safer.
Chief Medizadeh says they will take the concerns from the town halls to create more initiatives to better protect and serve our community. That will be done through the LPS's 2024 Strategic Policing Plan. Up next, changes are coming to Alberta's healthcare system. But first, a quick break. The Alberta government passed its first bill since the election. Bill 1, the Alberta Taxpayer Protection Amendment Act, prohibits the government from increasing personal or corporate income taxes without Albertans' approval through a referendum. One commentator said Alberta Premier Smith is figuratively slapping the handcuffs on herself, making it nearly impossible for her government to raise taxes. The bill passed its third reading, 47 to 35. The province also announced some changes to Alberta's healthcare system. It includes transitioning Alberta Health Services into an organization which focuses more on hospital care, urgent care, cancer care, surgeries, and emergency medical services. It will also answer to a 7-member board. Alberta NDP leader Rachel Notley says the changes will open the door to privatization, but Premier Daniel Smith says, quote, there is absolutely no plan to privatize health care. At a news conference during last weekend's AGM in Calgary, she corrected a journalist by saying she's not looking to dismantle AHS, but rather disaggregate it.
The way I think about it is Alberta Hospital Services. They should be providing the very best acute care in our 106 or so acute care facilities that we have across the country, or across the province. And so some of the things that you've already seen, you'll see a little bit more of. For instance, we already began the process of disaggregating mental health and addiction. It's a separate ministry that has, it's a separate authority, and more of those resources are going to fall under mental health and addiction. You saw a couple of weeks ago, primary health care. That is now also a separate pillar. One of the things we were surprised by is that primary health care really is the responsibility of the department, and yet the department only has 8 staff, whereas AHS has 122. So that's an imbalance. So we're pulling out and disaggregating primary care so we can address that as well.
Smith is promising that frontline jobs will be protected, but says there will be a, quote, process of streamlining in the management layers. The transformation is expected to take up to 2 years. Our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, says talk of the proposed changes actually came out in a leaked document earlier this week.
It's a big overhaul, and I think, at this point, people are still sort of trying to digest it and figure out what it means. But the Coles Notes version of it is that you're going to have 4 sort of separate agencies running healthcare in the province. You're going to have AHS is going to be responsible for hospitals and acute care. You're going to have a separate board for addictions and mental health, a separate board for continuing care, and a separate board for primary care.
And there was record-breaking attendance at the BMO Centre last weekend as more than 3,700 delegates attended the United Conservative Party's annual general meeting. BCN was there and reports that almost all resolutions passed. One person is taking credit for why this year's numbers are so high. Executive Director of Take Back Alberta, David Parker, says he rallied thousands of people to the AGM to support democracy.
I think there's over 2,400 people from Take Back Alberta here, and they're all very engaged. Every annual general meeting of the United Conservative Party, and it's different for every party how they do this, but they elect half of the board every year that governs that party. This board picks the rules of the game.
And while Parker's supporters hold numerous seats on the UCP board, Alberta Premier Daniel Smith says she's not concerned that more than half the board members are from TBA.
If anything, I would say what I hear mostly from people who want to seek a position on the board is they want to make sure that we have fair, open nominations, that we allow for a proper vetting procedure in advance of somebody being told, of a race being open, so that people are told whether or not they're going to be allowed to run in advance. Those are the reasons why people go on a board.
And during her keynote address, Smith took time to fire shots at federal leaders.
Even despite losing on Bill C-69. That legislation was struck down by the Supreme Court. They are still hell-bent on imposing those destructive leftist policies on the people of Alberta. You know what I say to them? Not a chance. Not as long as I'm Premier.
Two major issues in which Smith received the most applause were the government's plan for disaggregation of Alberta Health Services and parental rights.
I want every parent listening today to hear me loud and clear. Parents are the primary caregivers and educators of their children.
Attendees also approved 29 of the 30 policy resolutions. These include banning the use of electronic voting machines and provincial funding to supervise consumption sites and to refuse transgender women to be housed among biological female inmates in correctional facilities. A motion to implement a school voucher system was defeated. Policy resolutions are brought forward by party members and are non-binding, but they do provide grassroots direction on what it thinks the government's policies should be. Still to come, many Albertans are saying, hands off our CPP. Plus, we honor the veterans on this Remembrance Day. It appears that many seniors are quite concerned about Alberta potentially pulling out of the Canada Pension Plan. It was a hot-button topic that was not brought up during Premier Smith's address at the UCP's annual general meeting or during the throne speech. But it doesn't take away from the fact that it's on the minds of many Albertans, including our seniors. Jeanette Rocher reports.
At first it was like panic because you never know what the heck's going on with your livelihood as we get older. No, it's a little bit scary.
Scary, not just for herself, she says. DeJager is worried for her kids who still have a few working years ahead of them.
A little bit leery for the younger generation, let's put it that way.
On the flip side, the provincial government says the people of Alberta pay too much into CPP compared to the benefits they receive, and that an Alberta pension plan would fix all of that. But for now, DeJager says she's not buying Premier Danielle Smith's promise that seniors and working Albertans could actually see more money in their pockets if Alberta pulls out of the federal plan for its own provincial one.
I think that it's just kind of enticing to make it sound like they're benefiting, but we don't know that yet. So that's still to be found out.
Also to be found out is the actual amount Alberta would be entitled to.
We're not getting consistent information from different sources about what we're entitled to.
Bradley LaFortune is the executive director of Public Interest Alberta. He's been doing talks around the province about some of the concerns they're seeing with the province's proposal.
Number one, it's not a priority for most of the Albertans that we're talking to. People in Alberta are concerned about the economy, affordability, access to things like healthcare. Number two, within the details of the proposed plan, it's very clear that nobody except for the UCP government thinks that Alberta is entitled to 53% of the asset pool, which is $334 billion.
Federal Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland recently said she would ask the chief actuary to provide an estimate of the asset transfer.
But Alberta's choice about the CPP also implicates every single Canadian.
And although Premier Smith did not address the issue during the UCP annual general meeting over the weekend, she did respond to questions about it at a media scrum.
If there was any movement on that, it would be put to a referendum. All the assets would be put towards the fund, as well that you'd either have to see an equal or better benefits or equal or lower premium. I was pleased to see that Chrystia Freeland committed. And once we have that number, we'll have a better idea of whether or not Albertans want to go to a referendum.
CPP has been with us since '66. It's been good for 60 years. Why fool around with it? Let's put it that way.
For Bridge City News, I'm Jeanette Rocher.
This week, we observed not just Remembrance Day, but also National Indigenous Veterans Day. Many Canadians are not aware of the many sacrifices Indigenous people made in fighting for our freedoms and helping form the Canada we have today. Charles Crowchief is the son of an Indigenous First World War veteran who fought at Vimy Ridge. I had the opportunity to sit down with Crowchief to hear some of the stories his father passed down to him. You may recognize this mountain as Vimy Peak in Waterton. However, to the Blackfoot people, it is Mestoi Nanastiko, which translates to Crowchief Mountain, named after Joe Crowchief. Crow Chief fought in the First World War, particularly in the Battle of Vimy Ridge. The mountain was later unofficially named after him for his deeds on the battlefield. His son Charles was in Lethbridge to share some stories. Shortly after leaving his residential school, Crow Chief enlisted in the Canadian military. He says he regretted going to war.
This war doesn't belong to us native guys. We have nothing to do with it. But we go over there. I found that out. What am I doing here? Shooting other people. They didn't do anything to me.
Charles also shared a story of how his father saved a wounded soldier's life at risk of being shot by Canadian soldiers.
When he got the leader said, I will shoot you, both of you, right now. You know, we can't doctor him. He says, I didn't care. I saved him from that place.
And years later in Edmonton, Joe Crow Chief met that soldier's son.
They were in the bar. The guy gave it to him. He says, oh, you know, my dad was saved by this native. My dad's safe. The guy just jumped at him. So you're the guy.
The assault on Vimy Ridge began at 5:30 a.m. on Easter Monday, April 9th, 1917. For Bridge City News, I'm Naveen Day. Up next, a retired Canadian Forces colonel weighs in on the war in Gaza and Ukraine. But first, a short break. You know, some of the most terrifying moments in our history have been in the midst of conflict. Many historians agree that as we observe Remembrance Day, it is more important than ever to talk about war and history. Wayne King is a retired Canadian Forces colonel, and he gives BCN's Hal Roberts his thoughts on the wars in Gaza and Ukraine.
Wayne, war is never pleasant, but many people believe that it's often necessary to really fight for our freedoms. What are your thoughts right now on the ongoing war in Ukraine? And how about the war between Israel and Hamas right now in Gaza?
Those two situations, although separate locations in the structure, both in the Middle East, but they are linked in many subtle ways. The Ukrainian war is one which I certainly hope is resolved successfully in terms of expelling Russia from Ukraine and allowing Ukraine to resume its status as an independent, free, and democratic nation within the world structure. There is no reason, in my view, why Russia decided to invade and take over a good portion of the Ukraine territory. They may have had some squabbles, but that doesn't mean that they have the liberty and the right to assume ownership and sovereignty over what is an independent nation. My difficulty with the Russian invasion is that unless it is stopped in a very decisive and internationally supported manner, any political temporary halt to the war will only represent a short-term pause, allowing the Russian military and nation to rearm, restructure, reorganize, and come again whenever they feel strong enough to do it. As far as the Hamas versus Israeli situation, this whole thing has been a proxy war from other Middle Eastern nations. And certainly when Israel is attacked by, in an unknown manner, unforecast, unwarranted manner, they have every right to defend themselves. And there is, I think, the onus on the international community, whether through the UN or other national organizations, to seek a permanent and long-lasting solution. Israel deserves to be a sovereign, independent nation. The average citizen within the Gaza Strip and so on are not, in my knowledge and experience, a warlike group. They are hostage to the situation, and I certainly feel that they're being punished for the sins of other nations, and it's something that only through decisive international action it can be resolved in a good manner.
So, Wayne, what was your reaction like? I want to circle back to Ukraine for just a moment here. When that former Ukrainian officer who fought for the Nazis in the Second World War, I believe his name was Yaroslav Hunka, was honored in the House of Commons. Everybody stood up, gave him a standing ovation. That many people didn't even realize he was a former Nazi. What was your reaction like when you found out that our Canadian politicians were doing that?
Well, my reaction, like many, many Canadians, was that it represented a very dark blot on our international image. To recognize and celebrate an individual in our parliament who had that kind of a background, that kind of a linkage with the group that we fought a World War II over, is one which gave me a great deal of concern, and I think the majority of Canadians felt that it was something that never should have happened. Why this situation was not properly vetted in the first case, I don't know. I'm not a politician. I don't know how the ins and outs, the day-to-day activities occur, but clearly the ball was dropped, and very, very badly dropped.
Up next, the Trudeau Liberals' popularity seems to be tanking across the country, according to polls. Political analyst Brian Lilley weighs in after the break. Welcome back. The United Conservative Annual General Meeting in Calgary was well attended by the party's delegates, but also by the media. According to political reporter and Toronto Sun columnist Brian Lilley, one media outlet, the CBC, fired shots at the UCP for promoting parental rights. He tells BCN's Hal Roberts that the national broadcaster either has an agenda to push or is tone deaf. Take a look.
Brian, you've been a longtime critic of our public broadcaster, the CBC. Now, this time your criticism has something to do with their coverage of the UCP's most recent annual general meeting, the AGM, which took place in Calgary. I mean, Bridge City News was there. We were there at Stampede Park covering all the many resolutions that passed. As for CBC's coverage, what really caught your attention?
There's this great big headline, and then it was repeated on all their political chat shows. Controversial motion about parental rights. And I thought, can these guys not read polling? Have they not seen it? Or do they have an agenda? In my view, is they have an agenda on parental rights, which they just keep dismissing as illegitimate, ill-informed, bunch of hicks. The idea that this is controversial, of course, it comes back to the SOGI, the gender pronouns, all of those issues. And the most definitive polling we have on this is from a few months ago from the Angus Reid Institute. And they looked at it and said, should mom and dad be informed? Now, there was a split on whether mom and dad should be informed and give consent, or just be informed before schools can make changes to names, gender, or pronouns. But 78% said mom and dad have to be informed. That's the primary basis of why CBC says it's controversial. Only 14% in that poll said, oh no, mom and dad should never be informed. That's the side CBC's on. So they view a policy that 78% of Canadians say yes to, that 82% of Canadian households with children under 18 present say yes to, and they say that's controversial, but the 14%, the side that they are always defending, well, I mean, that's normal, that's mainstream, 14%. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. You wonder why CBC can't say that Hamas is a terrorist organization? They can't read a poll properly. They don't know what's controversial and what's mainstream.
You got to learn how to read the room. Brian, something Alberta Premier Daniel Smith has been talking a lot about recently is the potential of an Alberta pension plan. Now, this has also caught the attention of Federal Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland and our provincial counterparts who met recently to talk about it. How feasible is this, Alberta pulling out of the Canada Pension Plan?
It's feasible. It won't be easy. Obviously, as we discussed last week, Ontario's finance minister, Peter Bethlen-Falvey, a very conservative guy, very level-headed guy. He has concerns, especially when Daniel Smith says, we want more than half the money. That's going to make him sit up and say, well, wait a minute, we've got 40% of the population. How do you get more than half the money? So, there's going to be back and forth like this. But the Trudeau Liberals are really trying to campaign hard on this. As the Poilievre Conservatives were asking about the carbon tax pause this week and asking, will you extend it to the rest of the country? The Liberals would stand up and say, you can't even stand up for pensions. Why are you talking? Like, they are making this into an issue like you wouldn't believe how. They're trying to drill it down. I go back to the firewall letter, which is more than 20 years ago from Stephen Harper, where Stephen Harper said, we need a firewall in Alberta. And that includes an Alberta pension plan. I believe there was a call for an Alberta provincial police force. And people still in central Canada look at these ideas and say, well, how on earth can you do that? Well, Quebec has an Alberta Quebec pension plan. Quebec has a provincial police force. Ontario has a provincial police force. These sorts of things should not be controversial. It's how you go about doing it. Do you do it in a sensible manner? I'll give Premier Smith credit for this. She seems to be trying to do it in a sensible manner and says she won't even hold a vote until she can give Albertans a clear number on what's there. Maybe in the end, she only ends up with a better deal for Alberta, and that's probably a good thing for her voters. Maybe she ends up with an Alberta pension plan. If so, I hope it doesn't hurt the rest of the country. But that's the concern that you're going to hear from people like Peter Bethlen-Falvey. In the meantime, you're going to see the Trudeau Liberals campaign against Alberta, as they do on everything else, to try and scare voters in the rest of the country to vote for them rather than the Conservatives.
After the break, we speak with an award-winning artist celebrated for her abstract expressionist sculpting. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
We do have a collection of over 22,000 pieces. So we, for example, we loan works out. Right now, we're just about to send a piece to the Los Angeles County Museum of Art for a large exhibition that they're having. It's called Imagine Fonts.